Welcome to the NPR Network and the Boas podcast with your hosts Rob Stone, Keith McPeak, and myself, Warren Booth. On today's show, we will be talking about the Corallus caninus and the Corallus caninus patesi complex. We hope you enjoy it.
So how you guys doing?
Everything's good. Since our last recording, it's just semester has started, so it's a matter of kind of teaching. I've overloaded my teaching here in my final semester at the University of Tulsa, so my life just seems to be, in the classroom or in my office preparing for the next lecture.
Yeah.
I don't know why in my last semester I decided to offer an entirely new course, instead of just kind of like freewheeling it on courses that were already developed. But it is what it is, but I'm counting down the days to a trip to Costa Rica.
Nice.
And over Thanksgiving, and then after that, it's a matter of wrapping up everything where I am and moving to Virginia.
The Costa Rica trip, is that business or pleasure?
It's business. It's a course that I've taught. It's a tropical biology course that I've taught for maybe 8 or 9 years. And we get to go to La Selva Biological Station, which is northeast of San Jose. You kind of go over the mountain range. You're at the northernmost part of one of the major forest parks there, which is just really cool. So you get to see some really neat animals.
Cool.
We're in the range where you'll find Corallus annulatus, which is kind of cool. But, every other snake you bump into is going to be a ferret lance, which is kind of cool in itself, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
It's funny. It's ranked by the university as its most dangerous course, but also one that the students find most enjoyable. So we haven't had any horror stories yet, but it's always, I was meant to go on it the last couple of years, but COVID obviously closed all those things down.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of really chomping at the bit to get back into the rainforest because I love that place.
Nice. Good.
Yeah.
You had some boa litters too, I think, since last show we did, didn't you?
Yeah, so I'm trying to work it out. So I think when we did the last one, I might have had a litter of leopards, and then I was waiting on one more litter of Boa sigma, and those were the in this case it was a pure Sonoran Boa sigma anarthristic leopard bred to a pure Sonoran Boa sigma hypo het anarthristic.
Nice.
So so it was great. The thing is, I think I'd mentioned before, I'd been traveling so much that I missed the ovulation date and the post-ovulation shed date. So everything was just kind of like roughly, well, she's getting bigger, so she looks like she's gravid, she's basking, she's doing everything that she should do. I just got no idea when she's going to give birth, so it was just a matter of watching out for that waxy plug.
Yeah.
And once that appeared, then I knew things were going to happen pretty soon. So I have in my basement, I've got, where my snakes are, I've got a Google Nest security cameras.
Mm-hmm.
And I got one of those and I relocated it to the front of the cage of that female. And this is terrible because before I put that there, I was just going down to that room every hour or two, just checking on it. And then whenever I had that camera in front of it, I meant like every 5 minutes I'm looking at this camera to see what she's doing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because then, she wasn't doing much, but then I started seeing like jerky motions and all that kind of stuff. And I knew it was getting close and roaming around with the tail raised up. And then I went out for a run. And I came back like an hour later and she delivered babies. So altogether it was 13 babies and 5 slugs. So I was really happy with that. 7 of them were anarthristics.
Wow.
And then the other 5 were double het anarthristic leopards. So they're anarthristic het leopards and the rest are double het anarthristic leopards. In another shed or two, I'll be able to see that which ones are the hypos, because the hypo and Sonoran kind of is something that's pretty subtle at the beginning, but it becomes more obvious as they shed.
Yeah.
But the good thing is they all fed just a couple of days after their shed. So I'm really pleased with that. They all look fantastic. It's my first time producing anarthristic Sonorans again in 17 years, maybe somewhere around there, even though that trait originated in my collection back in Ireland in 2002. I just hadn't done much with them here. I bred hets and stuff like that here, but I hadn't actually produced anarthristics. So it was really great to see those. It's and that's my last litter for the year, and it's kind of a weird feeling, and it's the last litter for probably next year as well, because I'm not planning to breed anything because of the move.
Right.
So it's kind of that weird feeling. The last litter produced here, and in the 11 years I've lived, or 10 years I've lived in Oklahoma, I've produced a lot of baby boas. So it's kind of weird that that's all come to an end.
Yeah.
Coming to an end.
Right. Right.
But it definitely ended on a really high note, which I'm pleased with.
Yeah, that's awesome. Congrats.
What about you? I know that you had an unfortunate one, but
I've had a bad year. I've had a bad year with boas. So let's see. Since last time we talked, I've had slugs from an annulated. I've had stillborn and slugs from Russian Burgeri. I've had slugs with a Eastern Sanzinia.
man.
I had emerald drop, and I got 9 babies. Only one was really viable, though. The other ones just didn't make it, and there was 3 slugs in that. But I did get a hog isle boa litter, which I haven't done hogs in probably, like you're saying, 17, 20 years. So that was pretty exciting to get those babies. Been one of those years for me, though. You get those off seasons sometimes. The egg layers did good for me this year, but my boas I just didn't do very well with.
Wow, yeah, that's weird. Mine have always been pretty consistent. I think I can count the number of slug litters or stillborn litters really on one hand in the last 25 years or 26 years of breeding boas.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but I've talked to a bunch of people that have said the same thing this year, where they've just had catastrophic failures across most of their breedings, which is just weird,
Well, misery loves company, so that makes me feel more better.
But at least your egg layers did a lot better for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's always next year.
I was going to say that there's always next year. You've got enough animals to be able to cycle around and do other stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
very cool.
I know Rob just mentioned, you said something about you have a Puerto Rican female that's going to drop maybe in a few days.
Yeah, she looks really good. She's, a very good biennial breeder. Every other year has a clear cycle, and the male is the same. And one of those situations where you know that not putting them together would probably lead to problems. So more than anything, that's kind of why I do it. Is she develops big follicles. The male's super interested. So yeah, it's one of those you're looking at it saying, if I don't do this, I'm likely to get slugs or complications.
Cool.
But yeah, that'll be the 3rd litter from her. So we'll see how that goes.
Awesome.
One other cool thing that did happen, I got my copy of the more complete carpet python.
Look at how thick that baby is, huh?
That is just insane. It's made me realize I need to start weightlifting to 622 pages or something like that there.
Wow.
Just a beast. But I've been slowly going through it, and it's really good.
Yeah.
So I don't know how he's going to top that. It's pretty impressive.
Good deal.
So yeah, very cool. Very cool.
All right, so you want to get into this more? Let's dig into these emeralds.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a species that captivated me for many years. I was first attracted to Corallus through Hortulanus, or Hortulana, I think they're now called. But maybe a year or two into keeping Amazon tree boas, I started really getting interested in emeralds, and I got my first pair in this whole ordeal of a trip whenever I lived in Northern Ireland. I had to collect them from Scotland, and it meant getting on a ferry and crossing the ocean and the Irish Sea and getting them and bringing them back. And they sadly were the typical what you might expect from a wild caught pair of emeralds. After 6 months they were regurging, and that was it.
Yeah.
But over time, that didn't put me off emeralds. It just kind of like made me more interested in them. And I was able to pick up captive bred animals over time and just love those animals. And just sadly, before I moved to the US, I sold off my entire Corallus collection just to make the move easier. And that included a number of captive bred emeralds, which were just getting up to adult size and ready for breeding. But, it's a species that I made sure I was getting back whenever I was here. And now I've got a pretty decent kind of group, probably about 15 or 16 emeralds that we're playing with here. And, a mixture, all northern, all Guyana, the Guyana shield boas or northern shield boas. So none of the none of the basins, none of the Batisi.
Uh-huh.
But I've got the anaconda phase, and I've got the regular kind of white patterned phase. And over time, I'm going to add the true patternless if I can find them. But for me, I much prefer these over the basins. I know that some people might find that hard to believe, but I just find them really fascinating animals. I don't find them hard to keep once you got good animals, and I think they're just absolutely spectacular.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat as you. You know, I just like the Northerns. I think there's just I don't know what it is about them. There's just something different about them that I like a lot better than the basins.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems, you know, you got a lot of traits to breed for, and so that's kind of my thing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, and we can definitely get into that later on in the discussion about these traits, because really now when you're able to sit down with a whole group of animals and look at them, even those that are of the same phase, right? So if you just want to call them the standard kind of wild type, you know, white patterned, you know, kind of on the dorsal surface, even within those, you see a lot of variation, whether it's in the dorsal kind of triangle number or their size, or even on the sides, the blues or the yellows that come through, you know. So I think there's a ton of work to be done in the captive propagation of this species. It's really going to develop really some incredible lineages. And as I say, I don't think they're hard to keep, and I don't think they're hard to breed, at least in my experience. So I think once more people have captive bred animals in their hands, it's going to be a really fun species to watch as they kind of grow in the hobby in a more stable state, you know, away from these wild caughts that are very rarely doing well, into these captive animals that are really thriving.
Yeah,
you know. So they're a, you know, Corallus caninus is the you know, as we call it now. It was originally classified by Linnaeus, so this is one of those species that we can date right back to Linnaeus naming species, and he did so in like 1758. He called it Boa canina, and then it went through a series of different names over time until it finally settled on Corallus caninus in like 1893. And then, of course, since then, we've seen some reclassification occurring as well, and we can kind of mention that as well. But, you know, if we think about Corallus caninus, up until, you know, like 2009 or so, I think it was reclassified then, or it was split. It was considered a Corallus species with just an enormous range. Just like Corallus hortulana has got a massive range.
Right.
Caninus, as it was known then, also had a massive range. You know, from you know, the primary ones that we think of with the northern emeralds are Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. You'll also find them a little bit in eastern Venezuela. You'll find them in northern Brazil. But then if you add Batisi to it, which was then thought to be caninus, you know, you've got Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia. You've got Brazil as well. You know, just an enormous range for this green snake that sits on trees.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's been some really good work done in the last 10 or 15 years, which has started to separate those and reclassify them, right? So we can think about, you know, across that range, for any species with such a large range, it would be unnatural for there not to be either subspecies or even that being a species complex and splitting it up. You know, we talked about boa constrictor last episode, and we saw that even, you know, it's got a really large range as well. And it's split into a whole variety of different species and subspecies. Well, we saw the same thing happening with Corallus caninus, and it was split into Corallus batisi as a full species. Most people know them as the Amazon basin emeralds. And, you know, the ones that are classified or characterized by that, you know, really bright orange, you know, ventral surface and chin, the white stripe connecting the ventral or the dorsal triangles on its back, and of course, yeah, just the enormous price that's also associated with them. They're just crazily expensive. They occur in, you know, in that range. They occur in the kind of most Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. But what's interesting now as well is that there might be a third species, or I'll say subspecies, because there's a different lineage that they believe in the kind of uppermost Peru, which is, it looks like a basin emerald but without the striping mainly, and more lateral blotches. So if you go onto something like iNaturalist and look up Corallus, and bring up their map and look at those in the upper kind of regions of Peru, they look different. They're really cool, but there hasn't been any genetic work really to identify those as a species yet. But they are dramatically different genetically from other Corallus caninus. So if we think, if they did a study, or there was a study published by Nicholas Vidal in 2009 that looked at Corallus caninus from, as they were then, from Venezuela, Guyana, 2 regions in Brazil and Peru, and then also boa constrictor as an outgroup. The Corallus caninus from Venezuela and Guyana and so on were about 20% divergent from the boa constrictor. So the genetic sequence was divergent by about 20%. So if we think about even just a very simple 100 base pairs of sequence, 20 of those differed between boa constrictor and Corallus caninus. If we look at those Corallus caninus within like Venezuela and Guyana, there's only like 2%. Add northern Brazil to it, adds about 3%. So that's all within the species kind of range generally. If you go further into Brazil, that kind of doubles to about 6%. So we can see this is a separate species. Those ones from upper Peru were 16.4% divergent.
Wow.
Which is just absurd. Like, that's so dramatically different. There's just been nothing since then to look into that, to actually potentially then classify them as a separate species. And I would imagine with that level of divergence, they're going to be classified as a separate species. Just a remarkable level of divergence. And what's neat about this is that, it shows us that across that large range, we're looking at a Corallus complex. What we once considered Corallus caninus is actually very likely to be a multi-species complex, which is just really fascinating. Great because that increases biodiversity of the world. Bad because it decreases the population size of each species, right? So you've had one big species group, and now you've got lots of smaller kind of species, essentially, that are smaller population sizes, so it makes them at risk of extinction. But just a fantastic species.
So
the ones that we're going. Yeah.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, because while you're talking about this, when we talked about the boa constrictor complex, we talked about the different habitats that over that range that those snakes encompass. Now, do you know if there's a different habitat that over the ranges that these snakes take advantage of the caninus?
That's a good question. That's something I've never really looked into. Whenever I've been into rainforests are very much rainforest. There's every part of your field of view is taken up with something. There's trees growing on trees that are growing on trees. Like, there's so many limbs, so much diversity in plant life and trees and so on. I think it's probably somewhat stable in terms of a generalized rainforest structure. So I don't think it's like boa, where you're finding some that are, more not necessarily grassland or whatever, or desert, but that show significant variation of rainforest versus non-rainforest. I don't think we're seeing that with Corallus. These are a rainforest specialist. I think division into these species is split up by geographic barriers, by major rivers. I think these animals can't move across easily, and that creates genetic division, and also separation of just rainforest land, where you don't have any contiguous rainforest connecting, and that's going to lead to divergence over time as well, because they can't get from one plot to the next to breed. And then just the massive geographic area which this covers, it's not a small area, so therefore that also supports differentiation just on a geographic distance basis. From those being closer together are going to be more genetically similar than those farther apart. Hence, those from Guyana and Venezuela and likely Suriname are very close together geographically, in a sense, and therefore they're genetically very similar. But as you move further away from that, you increase genetic distance, and therefore increase the likelihood of differentiation into separate species.
I think in my head I'm thinking more of like very subtle differences, like maybe there's differences in rainfalls or the type of trees possibly that they're using, or you know what I mean? It's obvious that they're so specialized to a rainforest setup, but I wonder if there's differences in those rainforests even that perhaps make certain animals even more hardy for captivity, possibly even,
I need to look into that, because rainfall is likely to show variation across that. You got some elevational variation. It would be interesting to look at. Temperature-wise, I think it's relatively stable across most of that range that the species occurs in.
Right.
But maybe rainfall is kind of a driver, and maybe understory is something that should be considered because babies hang out in the understory as well. So maybe where these animals are occurring, that's something I haven't really looked into, and I'm not really aware of any real scientific papers that look into that. There's some papers that talk about the use of canopy by Corallus caninus, just movement, but that's just observational stuff. I'm not aware of anything that shows like any kind of niche partitioning of the juveniles using a different habitat than the subadults and the adults and so on, and how that might vary across the range.
Right.
I don't really know. What we just know is quite simply the juveniles occur in the lower understory because they're close to the ground and close to the things that are going to move around that they're going to eat, and the adults are more higher up in the canopy. So, but as a species, they're really interesting because Corallus caninus is probably the most basal species of that group, right, of the whole Corallus complex. It's the most ancient, realistically. That and Cropani evolved somewhere around 45 to 50 million years ago. That lineage that formed those, that's when it diverged, kind of the middle Eocene. And then from there, from Cropani, you then get Annulatus, and then you get Ruschenbergeri, and then you get the Hortolanus complex. And we'll talk about the Hortolanus complex in another episode, because that's a really interesting one, because we talk about Grenadensis and Cooki and Hortolanus, but Grenadensis and Cooki are kind of nested within this whole Hortolanus group, so they might not even be a species. They might not even be valid species.
Right.
Or Hortolanus might be multiple species, so that can be another conversation for another day. That whole group evolved only about 11 million years ago, so the caninus are an old lineage, of the 35 to 50 million years ago in terms of evolution, which is really cool. And then their closest ancestor is kind of Epicrates and Eunectes. And then their closest ancestor would be the kind of the boa constrictor group, So it's an interesting evolution of the whole kind of lineage as you go through it, The ones that we're going to talk about and focus on tonight are going to be the kind of northern shield boas, the Guyana, those from Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, and a little bit of Venezuela, a little bit of Brazil. Of course, the ones that we talk about and the ones that we have access to in captivity are those that are going to be from Guyana and Suriname primarily, and as a result shipped out of Paramaribo, right, in Suriname, and Georgetown in Guyana. They're the two kind of major export sites for those, and they'll have been collected over a relatively wide range within those countries. But they're the ones that we're going to focus on tonight, I think.
Yeah. Now, I heard a lot of the collection, and maybe a little more insight on this. This is just anecdotal from what I've talked to people about, but it seems like a lot of them are collected from waterways. That they'll go out with flashlights at night and go down these waterways and look for eye shine on these branches right over the water, just kind of creep up on with a boat and snag them off these branches. Have you heard that also?
It makes sense, right? So I've definitely heard it with Ruschenbergeri, with Trinidad tree boas, for example. They're often found. The people that I talk to find them when they're out on boats going along the edges of waterways. I know the same for Hortolanus. Some friends have done the same thing with Hortolanus. For caninus, it kind of makes sense, right? Whenever you're a species that's trying to avoid getting eaten by other things, they like to sit on really thin limbs. And if those limbs are at the end of branches that are over some water body, there's going to be very few larger animals that can actually come over that way to then capture those. So it kind of makes sense from a predator avoidance kind of technique.
Right.
But the other thing is it just might be it makes it easier to see, right? So what you see with Corallus, which is kind of cool, is that their eyes shine red whenever you have a flashlight. So like I'll go into my basement at night and I'll just use a flashlight to see what animals are doing. But if I pan around and I look at the Ruschenbergeri, for example, they all have red eyes, reflecting back at you. And I believe caninus have the same thing. I think most Corallus have that reflective eye shine. So when you're in a dense rainforest, and I can vouch for this, it's hard to see many things, right? Especially when you're looking into the trees, because you're getting a lot of eye shine from spiders as well and stuff like that. If you're if you're in a boat going along, these rivers with the limbs hanging over you, there's density of those branches is reduced, and therefore it might just be easier to see them.
Yeah.
So whether they're actually congregating along those areas, I don't know. It might just be much easier to see them and therefore capture them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can cover a decent area in any period of time whenever you're on a boat. Whenever you're looking for animals, there's two ways you can really do it in the rainforest. You can walk slowly and try and look around you to see everything, or you can walk pretty fast and cover more ground and hope to see something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the covering more ground when you're on a boat is probably a more easy way of getting larger numbers of animals.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense.
I'd love to see it. I've never been in an area where caninus occurs, but they are a species that I would love to. I'd love to see in the wild. I've seen annulatus in the wild, and they're really cool. But I'd love to see caninus in the wild just to see what they look like in terms of quality and stuff like that. Because what we see of wild-caught emeralds are after they've been put through weeks of dehydration and stress and so on. So I'd like to see the alternative of that.
And also the way they're living.
Yeah, right. Like people talk about them, these giant teeth that they've got, and that's specialized for eating birds. And from the studies that I've read, that's not the case. They're primarily mammal eaters, eating these arboreal rodents. And the teeth make sense because there's two ways to think about it. One is that it's for penetrating kind of that thick layer of fur. But it's also, if you're an animal that's pretty high up in the canopy and you snatch a rat, then the last thing you want to do is that rat to fall out of your teeth, whenever you're coiling it. So I think it's just another way of it preventing the prey from being lost. Because if you lose that, it's not as if the snake can just go around and find it again. It's gone. It's 30 feet below and disappeared. So those teeth make sense.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I've never been bitten by them, but
I have. But
I don't want to think.
But I also have noticed in captivity that I do believe that if you feed live, which I've done occasionally, when you do feed live, that when they grab that prey, it's almost like a bunch of daggers going into that prey, and it actually subdues them, almost like a bird of prey's talons when they hit a bird or a squirrel or something. And I think it almost like immobilizes that animal when they're grabbed with those teeth. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah.
Not a lot of struggle.
Yeah, I've never had to feed live. So it's kind of like I kind of dread the thought of of a large emerald grabbing a live rodent, but it is what it is. I've always been lucky enough that my adults are all very readily accepting. Even wild caught established ones that I've got will take defrost food, for their first meal.
Yeah.
We can talk about feeding in a bit, but they are, they're remarkable. Those teeth are just, I was helping or assisting a shed for an animal a couple of years back, and just working around the eyes and the head. Whenever you're holding it, and the mouth opens up and you see the size of those teeth when the skin retracts from the jaws a little bit. Wow, it really is a force to be. You don't want to screw around with that. So you have been bitten by one?
Yeah, I've been bitten by him. I know Ed Marino said too that he had taken a bite from one of the basins to the face and in his eyelid, and he was so close to like actually getting his eye punctured by that. He was lucky that it just missed his eyeball when he got bit. Yeah,
I was bitten by a 6.5 foot Corallus hortulana, and maybe 20 years ago, and it was a slow bite, so I felt every tooth kind of puncture into my skin slowly.
Yeah.
And then the teeth on those were nothing compared to the emerald of the same size.
Yeah.
So
I always seem to get bit in the knuckle, and like I'll lose a tooth in my knuckle. It always seems to be the way.
Yeah. That happened to me once with a Hog Island boa, and about 4 months later, I was sitting eating dinner, and I bent my finger because there was pain in it, and this little tooth just popped out of it.
Yep.
You
I've
know,
had that
the
happen
weirdest
many
thing.
times. It's a very relieving feeling when it finally happens.
Absolutely. So, do you want to talk about? Well, let's just be general to start off with, right? If we're going to talk about the kind of the northern shield boas, size wise, adults about 5 feet. They're not huge. 5.5 feet is generally a big one, right? Ruschenbergeri certainly get bigger. Even Hortolana can get longer, but they're heavy bodied. That's the big difference, right? They're not a slender. As an adult, they're not necessarily a slender boa. They've got some size to them. And interestingly, there's no real visible sexual dimorphism. In many species, I find some level of sexual dimorphism with males either being larger or smaller, compared to the females. But definitely, as adults, there's some variation. For example, with my boa sigma, I always find the males much smaller than the females. Right? I think we mentioned that in the last show.
Yeah.
But there's no real sexual dimorphism that we see in Corallus caninus. So the males and the females are pretty much the same size. 5 foot, 5.5 foot as a relatively large adult. As juveniles, that's one of the cool things, obviously, about Corallus caninus is that color change. I think that's something that probably grabs many people whenever they first, find that book that's got emerald tree boas in it, and they show a picture of an adult and then a picture of a baby,
Right.
and they're just so dramatically different. We always think about the babies being red. Sometimes you see green ones. That's kind of cool whenever you see a green baby emerald.
Yeah.
I love those, but two other ones that really stand out for me are the orange ones. And the reason I say that is because the litters that I've produced have always had orange babies and red babies. I've never produced a green one. But and there's interesting things that go along with that. I find that the orange babies then transition to yellow and then to green, and they do so much earlier than the red babies from the same litters. So it's interesting to see this color variance or variation in the duration of that ontogenic change. But I don't know if you remember, a number of years ago, Tony Nicolai bred two anaconda phase together, which are for those that aren't familiar, they lack the white pattern, and where the white pattern will be, it's replaced by kind of charcoal gray or blackish kind of dorsal patterns, almost like an anaconda, if you think about it like that. He bred two of those together and produced something totally different. He produced these yellow babies. Do you remember those?
Yeah.
Yeah, just out of this world. And they had striping and so on. If anybody hasn't seen that, search the web for Tony Nicolai's anaconda phase breeding, because they were just exceptional. But we tend to see red and green, primarily red is the way to go. And over the space of about a year to a year and a half, they'll go through that ontogenic change to their adult colors. And that's a really cool thing to watch, because, you see little sprinkles of scales coming in of changing from the red to the yellow to the green and so on. It's a fun thing to watch. So for anybody that has the opportunity to buy baby emeralds, they'll really enjoy that whole transition.
Yeah, they're beautiful when they're going through that change. It's like every shed, they're just a little different, and you're almost wishing they would just stay like that, and then they change again.
Right, and then they change completely. Yeah. And they can do it fast. Like it's, the great thing about having our iPhones or whatever we use is that we've got a camera in our pocket, so it's so easy to take a picture almost every day. And I've been tempted to do that for this recent litter that I had. If I hold any back, just to take a picture of the same animal each day, because then at the end of the year or whatever, you can put these 365 pictures together to see that whole transition period, and how it changes color. It would be cool to do it with an orange one and a red one side by side. So I'll have to see what I can do. But even the green ones go through some level of change as well.
Yeah.
And, it's not as if they're born green and they stay green. They do transition in the type of green that they show and the amount of black and so on as well.
Yeah, I've had quite a few green actually in my litters over the years. I've been fortunate to get those, and it is a surprise when you look in there, because you right away it's like a miniature adult. You're used to seeing the like you say, the orange or the red, but when you see a green one, it's definitely pretty spectacular in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's for me, that's interesting in itself, because I would like to get some that were born green and then pair those together to see if they produce more green babies than red.
Yeah. And
then do the same thing with those that are orange and do the same thing with those that are red to see if there's any kind of color, level of inheritance of color, of juvenile color or neonate color. It's something that maybe in time we'll when I've got a little bit more space. It's something I plan to do. If I certainly produce any green babies, I'll be holding some back for that distinct purpose.
Yeah, well, even like you said, because I've bred anaconda and those babies, and you have one, tended to be a little bit more on the yellow side too. So.
Oh yeah, the one that you sent me, the yellow in that animal is out of this world.
Yeah.
It's like a highlighter yellow color. It's just it stands out so completely different than the other neonate emeralds that are roughly the same age.
Right.
Just looks so different, which is just remarkable. So I'm excited to see how that develops over time, because I remember we talked about this maybe a couple of years ago about the idea of that that yellow, is it a heritable trait?
Right.
And I think there's probably something to that, because if you look even at the northern shield boas, forget about the Batisi, which have got that really bright yellow. Just look at the northern shield caninus. You will see some that have got real yellow ventral surfaces. You'll see some of the yellow under the chin can be really vibrant. And sometimes creeping up the sides, you can see a lot of yellow. Mm-hmm. In others, you might see blue instead. So I've got ones that are got this really blue scales all the way along. It goes from green to blue into the kind of creamy white color of the ventrals.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of variation. I think selective breeding is going to really start to bring out lines that show those, right, that there's a heritability to them.
Right.
And if you're thinking about that as well, I don't know if you've seen it. A number of years ago, there was a book by Kivett and Wiseman, and it had a picture of a yellow and green caninus that was in the wild that was just like a green racing stripe down its back, and it was yellow along the sides. The lateral sides were pure yellow.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you go on to iNaturalist, there's another one that they found in the wild just like that as well. It's pictured. So that's it's clearly a heritable trait.
Yeah.
But it shows that yellow is there. And that's something that can be selectively bred for over time. Of course, unlike many organisms that you can selectively breed, emeralds just take a little bit longer. So your breeding projects to highlight yellow might be a 25-year process instead of a
pass it on to your kid. Yeah.
Right. You better instill that love of emeralds into kids early on.
Rob, you might be able to comment. Didn't Michael Barrera in Florida have one of those canary
he had a pixelated
yellow
one?
Yeah,
he called it pixel.
Yeah, I don't know whatever happened to that animal.
I think it died. I think he still has the siblings, because he had asked me at one point, was I interested in them? I did some genetic work for Michael on some turtle parentage stuff, and we got talking, and he mentioned, was I interested in those? And then he named the price, and all of a sudden I wasn't interested in them. But I think that the actual pixel died, and I don't know whether it was regurgitation, but it did die, which was a pity, because it was a really cool looking animal.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was sharp.
I'll have to look back on my notes to see what was, because he had, I don't know if he had the parent to that or just that and the siblings, but they also showed some level of pixeling, I think, but just not as much as that one there, which was really cool.
Yeah.
And then there's also the granite ones. Have you seen the granite ones in Europe?
Is that the ones that have the gray in them? Like that grayish?
Yeah, it's like gray, white, and black scales. That's just absurd as well. And then, of course, you see the odd black one that appears as well.
Right.
And I know that Forrest Fanning had a black caninus that he got. Unfortunately, it died. But it was a guy just had it and kept it as a pet and sold it on Craigslist.
Crazy. Chad Gray had one pop up in a litter, and he sold the animal, and it developed the black over time after he sold it. But it got extremely, very dark black.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting, it's, the heritability of those traits, we just don't know, because people get a little bit kind of impatient with their emeralds, and they buy wild caught, and how is it with their captive bred and so on. That leads to disaster very often.
Yeah.
They don't quarantine long enough, and they give up easily if they don't find it, just as easy as a corn snake to breed or a ball python to breed, and they might take a little bit more work. So those kind of traits, that they're going to take a little bit longer to get established, but they are very cool. With the Northern Shield, we've got that anaconda phase. We've got a true patternless, which is also really interesting. Have you got any of the true patternless?
Yeah, I have that.
Pattern?
I have one animal. Yeah, it's just all green. It's just all green.
You know, one of my first interactions with caninus was a very good friend of mine, Jonathan Harvey. He was buying emeralds in the UK from I mentioned the guy Clive Osborne. He was a locality Boa guy and an importer. He also brought in Corallus, and my buddy Jonathan bought a number of true patternless wild caught caninus, and those things were spectacular. Just not a variant in the scale. It was just green from head to tail.
Yeah.
And sadly, they all got lost over time to regurgitation, I believe. But that's a variant that I would really like to get. I'm just not doing it at the moment because I need to have a separate place to quarantine that kind of thing for a long period of time.
Right.
But I'd love to know the heritability of those traits. You know, if you pair patternless to patternless, do you get patternless, or do you see, you know, you've done anaconda to anaconda and you've had patterned pop up, right? So,
yeah.
So you know, trying to tease apart the heritability of these is certainly something that's still going to take time.
Yeah.
You know, I've got 2.2 anaconda phase, and I'm hoping to pair those at least a male and two females at the end of next year, just whenever I'm resettled in Virginia. I plan to pair those because, you know, they were wild caughts that I just took through the whole establishment process really carefully, and those things are just bomb proof. You know, I posted a picture on my Instagram a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday, and on Facebook of one of the females. She eats large rats.
Right.
You know, and has no problem with that. One large rat every month, and she is just bomb proof. You know, the other ones eat medium rats.
Let's get into that while you're talking about that. Let's get into how you like to establish a wild caught animal.
Yeah, so wild caught's very simple for me. The biggest killer of reptiles in general that are wild caught is dehydration. These things are captured, and you might think, well, they're captured in a rainforest. You know, they're housed in an exporter there in a rainforest. It doesn't take long for an animal to dehydrate, and whenever it dehydrates, it screws up the kidneys. And the kidneys, unfortunately, are really hard to recover. So what will happen with many of these emeralds is they come in so dehydrated because they've gone from a point of capture to an exporter to an importer in whatever country, an importer to a dealer, right? And then that dealer to a customer. And that period of time can be many weeks or even months, where they've had very little access to water, a species that's drinking water every single day in the rainforest. So the kidneys packing in is just a major issue for a lot of those. And you see a lot of it whenever you look at a wild-caught emerald, you look at the top of its head. You look at those two big kind of bulbs behind the head, and if they're sunken inwards, then it's a sign of that these animals are likely dehydrated. So what I do, I don't like to get wild-caught animals, but sometimes for certain things I need to. So, for example, for the anaconda phase, we just don't see a lot of captive-bred anaconda phase popping up. Well, we don't see a lot of captive-bred, period, right, at the moment, but we don't see a lot of anaconda phase. If I could find captive anaconda phase readily, I would have bought those over the wild-caught. But I couldn't, so I got the wild-caught, and all adults, you know, decent size. I like to get smaller, but these were all big adults. First thing that I do, you know, many people will bring them in. They'll try to offer them food. They'll try to, you know, treat them for internal parasites and so on. I don't do any of that. These come in. I put them into Rubbermaid containers with a couple of branches at different levels. A couple of just dowel rod branches. Some fake kind of silk plants to give them some kind of level of cover, or at least, you know, make it less sterile. And I use arboreal water bowls. So I put these right up at the edge of the perches where the animals can just reach over and drink from, because that's in the wild. They're drinking from their own scales whenever it rains, or they're drinking from pools of water that form in the crooks of trees and so on. So I give them access to arboreal water bowls. I use just paper towel bedding just to keep an eye on them. But I change that water daily. Fresh water, you might have seen this yourself. And we see it with lots of other animals, but fresh water, it seems to be this trigger for an animal just to drink. You know, if I put fresh water bowls in with all of my boas, I guarantee that I can come back in 10 minutes and they're all drinking as much as they can, even though they've got access to water every day. But for those emeralds, I think arboreal water bowls with fresh water every single day is very important. Fresh water
Yeah.
is key. And it's only, I'll keep an eye on them. And generally, once they go through that, they'll generally shed within a month of coming in. I don't offer them food at this point. I'm just, my only concern is they're into these tubs. The only disturbance they get is to have the water bowl either topped up or replaced daily, and then the lid's closed and they're away. They're in the corner of one of my rooms in my lab, so they're not in any stressful area. And after they shed, and after I can see that they're, a good idea whenever an indicator whenever you have an emerald that's hydrated, you spray water onto it, and it forms really nice tight beads.
Right.
And if it's dehydrated, the skin looks a little crinkly, and that water kind of runs off it very easily. It doesn't stick there, it doesn't stay with that kind of beaded look. And I think on my Instagram page, I might have pictures of these anaconda phase after the first maybe couple of months of establishment with me, and they've always got that beautiful beaded look whenever I've sprayed them. And so after that, it can be a month, it could be longer. I'll finally start to offer food. And I think with this group, I was offering food maybe after about 6 weeks, and none of them took. This was defrost, superheated rodents. They just weren't interested. So I just sit back and wait, and I wait until they're sitting with their heads pointed down, and that kind of, they're clearly hunting.
Right.
So if they're moving around a cage, that's fine. But I want to see them at night or first thing in the morning, coiled on that branch with that head hanging down in that kind of S shape, where if a prey walks past it, they're going to nail it. And once I see that, that's whenever I start offering food when they're in that position. So it'll be late at night or it'll be first thing in the morning. And the nice thing about where I am at the moment is that we live 1.25 miles from my lab. So I can nip over late at night and my wife's not going to kill me because I'm still trying to get emeralds to feed. I'm not having to travel any real distance or first thing in the morning. And what I'd found with these group was several of them took, after they were sitting in that position, this would have been maybe after 3 months, then they readily took small to medium rats. And the way I look at it is, if these animals are going to regurge, they're going to regurge from day one, and the meal size isn't going to be your trigger. There's another underlying factor that we can talk about later on about that. So I offer them decent sized meals. So if a female should normally be eating a medium rat, that's what they get as their first meal. I don't start them off on a small thing. And I just monitor them. Another female that I had, a really big one, she didn't want rats. She would take chicks, however, and I would feed her 3 or 4 chicks in a sitting. And then after several feedings like that, I started scenting the rat, and then she switched over to just rats, unscented rats. And she eats large rats now every month.
Yeah.
So I keep my animals in a quarantine for at least a year in that setup. So they're in the minimalistic Rubbermaid containers. There's a heat mat on the bottom. I say there's 3 perch levels, and on the middle one I put the probe at 84 degrees. So that means if they want to get heat, they can move to a lower perch because it's closer to the heat mat in the bottom.
Uh-huh.
Or if they want to get away from that and get cooler, they can go higher up. So it's kind of the reverse of what they might find in nature, but the animals seem to understand what to do there. And I will see them thermoregulate. Once they've eaten, they'll move closer to the heat, they'll move further away and so on. Thermoregulation, I think, is key. It's worked out very well for me in terms of reproduction and general health of my animals. And after about a year, maybe longer, 14, 15 months, then I'll move them into their lifelong enclosures. And what I tend to use for my emeralds, for my females, I like to put them in 4 feet long, 2 feet high, 2 feet deep. People talk about height being more important. I don't see that. I think 2 feet is a good size for an emerald, but mine are constantly moving.
Yeah.
You think about these animals just sitting on a branch. I'm going to have to set up cameras on my emerald enclosures to show how much these animals move and thermoregulate. So I use radiant heat panels. I use UVB forest level, kind of 5% UVB bulbs. I have live plants, and I use natural branches. So I find them that where I can, they can have multiple different heights. I don't use the standard kind of, PVC or whatever dowel or whatever.
Yeah.
I just don't think it looks as natural. I like having some level of natural look. Cypress mulch on the bottom, and because they're rarely touching the bottom anyway, but I just cypress mulch from Home Depot or Lowe's, and I put the branches in such a way that they can get really close to the heat panel or further away from it. So that gives them that range. In that 4-foot enclosure, they can get up to 99 or 90 something degrees, 92 degrees, I think is the hottest. I've seen them 93 degrees, or away down into the 70s. And they will continually thermoregulate. I've got one animal that will sit under the heat more than the others, but the others will just constantly move around, and they're constantly, every day I walk in, they're sitting on a different perch at different levels, and I'll temp gun them, and they're 84 one day and they're 78 the next, and so on. And these animals are just thriving. And I never worm them. I never treat them for internal parasites. Only if they show any issues where they're losing weight will I even think about it, or if I see like tapeworms in their feces. But it's the same with my imported from wild Trinidad tree boas that we brought in, I don't know now, 4 years ago. They've never been treated for internal parasites. The emeralds are the same. I just don't. They don't. I think, being an arboreal animal, they shed a lot of these internal parasites when they defecate, and because they're not coming into contact with it again, they're not reinfecting themselves, such as, ground-dwelling animals would. So I've never had an issue with having to treat them for that there, and they gain weight, so they're clearly thriving. And with those, I have them, as I say, when they're in their final cages, again, that kind of middle perch is set at 84, and that gives the full range for them to have hotter or cooler. And what I do then differently is that I set that on a time schedule where they'll have that temperature from 8 in the morning until 8 at night, and then it'll switch over to a cooler cycle, which will be 4 degrees lower. So to give it some level of cycling, which might be a bit more natural.
With your purchase,
and I do that with all of them, and then it's just
with your purchase. Sorry to interrupt you. With your purchase, I like to give mine like a little X somewheres in the cage also, because the females, I notice when they're either ovulating or gravid, or if you fed a large meal, they seem to like to lay on that more than the typical coil. Have you noticed that also?
I've seen it with feeding. I've seen it with ovulation as well, where they'll actually their head and their neck will be coiled around one branch, and then their tail is around another one, and their mid body is kind of propped against something else. So they are
kind of roll
kind of using it
a little bit.
Yeah, and they'll use it for comfort or something. I've seen it, females using the arboreal water bowls for the same kind of thing as well.
Yeah.
And then, once after a couple of days of digestion, then they'll go back into their regular coiling.
Right.
And the other thing that's important to note there is that the perch size is really important, because people think they can just throw in any kind of perch size and the animals will do well, and that's not the case. My adult emeralds, I'm more likely to find them on really thin perches than they are on larger perches. And
Yeah.
I mean a 6 or 5.5 foot emerald that's eating a large rat will be sitting on a perch that's 3/4 inch at most.
Yeah.
I rarely see them going more than that. They sit on the edges and right at the extreme ends of these perches and just hang there.
Yeah.
And therefore, with babies, they're even finer. I think I've read something in the past, and it might have been with emeralds, or it might have been about green tree pythons, about if the perch is too big, it can cause damage to the tail and their back. Yeah, so you get dislocations. Yeah. So with that, I miss my animal. Well, when they're in those cages, they're in automatic misters. They're on those kind of Mist King misters, and that comes on, I think, 3 times a week for maybe like a minute, and it primarily wets the substrate. I'll go along and I'll hand mist them every now and again. People say you shouldn't mist the animal because it will cause evaporative cooling and cool the animal down. I don't think it's going to be that dramatic. And the water that I'm using is not cold tap water. It's been sitting in the room, and sitting at a decent temperature. So I'll mist them as well, and they'll drink from their coils.
Yeah, Dennis McNamara, he's a curator of reptiles at the Virginia Zoo, and I saw an interview with him, and then I talked to him about it. His animals, almost all of his reptiles, but at the zoo, they missed, and they missed those animals twice a day, and they'll miss those animals till they stop drinking. If the animal drinks for 20 minutes, they miss for 20 minutes. If the animal drinks for 30 seconds, they just miss for 30 seconds. And he does fantastic with the emeralds.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, up until I put together these whole new enclosure sets in my office, I was also using an ultrasonic humidifier, the system that that piped into these enclosures. And whenever that turned on, because I use it to simulate dew formation in the morning. So it would come on for like an hour between, I think it was 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. And I'm going to set it up again. I just haven't had the chance to. As soon as that came on, those animals within 5 minutes were really active and they were moving around. So I've never had an issue with defecation with emeralds. That's one thing that we can talk about. Some people seem to, the animals seem to get backed up a little bit and they have to use rain chambers and this and that. I've never had to.
Me neither.
I think just because I give the animals a lot of space in these enclosures and they're misted in such a way that movement in combination with the misting and the ultrasonic humidifying kind of stimulates just that movement and therefore that defecation. Also, animals that are not defecating readily often are showing some levels of dehydration, and that can be a problem as well. So I've been lucky in that I haven't had to deal with that. I know that some people take their animals out and put them in rain chambers every 2 weeks and so on. I just don't do that. I don't.
Yeah, no, neither do I. I think a lot of animals, a lot of snakes anyway in captivity, they don't necessarily, like, you don't see them like a dog get up and go over and get a drink. Like, they run into their water bowl. So I always try to put my water bowl in an area where the path of the snake is going to find it the easiest, because every time they run into that water bowl, they drink. If you see them cruising, as soon as they run into that water. So I always try to place water bowls where the animal's going to come in contact with it the most.
Yeah, I've liked for neonates. I've really liked those specialty designs. Is that the David Bram's company?
Right.
He does ones for like the Rubbermaid shoe boxes, and they've got the circle in it where you can drop with the deli cup.
Right.
Man, because those little emeralds, they're constantly cruising at night, and I just watch them, and they as you say, they bump into it, and the first thing they do is they drink.
Yeah.
And it might only be for a couple of seconds, but they bumped into it and they drink.
Right.
Which kind of shows the importance of keeping fresh water.
Yeah.
In a rainforest, when it's raining so much, it's constantly fresh, and keeping that water fresh in those little pools in the tree limbs and the crooks and so on. So fresh water is essential for those. As I say, with feeding, I've always been I'll feed large prey less often. So, what I'll do for my neonates, and it's funny because I found this out a number of years ago when I bred emeralds. They don't really recognize pink mice, I found. I think they're just too small, and the heat signature is lost too quickly. Hopper mice, however, were the key. Hopper mice or pink rats that are defrosted and just warmed up in very hot water, or else what I do is I just put them into a Ziploc bag, throw them onto a heat mat, and then once that bag is starting to sweat, then those things are ready to go, and I just wiggle it in front of the animals, and most of them will take that as their first meal, a hopper mouse, because I think it's a larger, and it looks too big for the baby snakes, but these things just destroy those. And I was chatting to a really good friend of mine recently, a guy called Rich Eiley, and Rich Eiley was the first guy to introduce the salmon boa trait in Boa imperator a number of years ago. But he bred emeralds. I forget the number that he told me he got. I think he got like a 1.4 group of wild-caught animals, big animals. And a year or two later, they all bred. And he produced 64, I think he said 64 baby emeralds.
Oh.
In his first time breeding emeralds from 4 litters, I think it was 64, or 5 litters, it was 64 babies. And it just blew my mind, And he turned around and he said, well, Warren, the key is this, hopper mice. And I said, it's exactly the key.
Yeah.
Hopper mice, just, people I see struggling to get their emeralds to eat, and they're offering them live pinkies and this and that. Man, hopper mice mine just take off on those like they're candy. And then with those, I offer them about every week to 10 days as neonates. And then as they get older, I'll space them apart, and I move the prey size up pretty large, or pretty rapidly, so that they're on by the age of a year to a year and a half, they're on, you know, medium to large mice, and then as soon as I can, I'll move them into small rats. So I think when they're normally at the kind of 3 feet stage, probably 2.5, 3 feet, probably 3 feet, they're probably eating small rats. So, you know, if you're looking at the snake, and the small rat will look bigger than the girth of the snake, but that's what I feed. But at that point, maybe it's every 3 weeks. And then as an adult female, a medium to a large rat every 4 weeks is my key. And then, but then again, I stop feeding my snakes in November and don't start feeding them again on a regular routine until kind of March again. So they're eating large meals for a short period of time.
Yeah, they're definitely a food cycling species, without a doubt. More so than anything else I've worked with, I think.
Yeah, you know, because in their range, the monthly temperatures don't change dramatically for a temperature cycling. So just like boa constrictor, in my opinion, and boa imperator and boa sigma, they're a real food cycling as a real trigger for breeding. So I do that. The males, I'll give, you know, a small to medium, whatever rat. My males, while they're not a sexually dimorphic species, I kind of keep my males smaller.
Mm-hmm.
I just find them to be more ready, more active breeders when they're, you know, thinner and kind of less sluggish. So like some of my adult males that I'm using are like 13 years old, 14 years old. I've got some really nice ones that Rigo Walder produced, and I've got them, and they're still producing. The males are still producing babies, and at 13, 14 years of age, and they're still showing those. And those I feed a small rat to once every 3 to 4 weeks, and they just do really well.
Yeah.
But you know, they take a while to get up to size, so it's not a species that you're going to turn around and start breeding at 3 years of age.
No.
Males might, but you know, I think females are definitely a 5 year, maybe even 6 year before their first reproduction. You know, I find with Corallus ruschenbergeri, my females were actually showing their real interest in breeding at 8 to 9 years of age.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they just take longer. I think we underestimate the age of some of these animals. You know, you see some of those big emeralds that come in, the 5.5 footers. You know, the big head on them. Some of those I'd probably say are 25, 30 years old.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, that's problematic for breeding because people think, oh, I'll get that big female and, you know, it's going to produce babies for me, but they could be more difficult to actually establish into the kind of breeding cycle if they go wild caught.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, start small and work from there is kind of my motto. If you can do that, if you need to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so do you want to talk about your breeding kind of plan, and then I can take you through mine as well.
Yeah, I kind of
see where we differ, where we're similar.
I kind of do the same, like we were talking about as far as the food cycling. I'll feed them up until November, and then I usually go from December and January with no food, and then February is when I actually start feeding again towards the end of February, and then I start hitting them hard in March and April. Usually that's when I'll see my ovulation too. Usually I'll get like 3 to 4 meals in the female, and that's when I'll see them ovulate. And it's usually like the 4th meal is a good sized meal, and you know, they blow up right away after that. But the males I find, you know, when I pair with a female, if he's not showing interest in, I don't even leave him in there. They seem to, for me anyway, if I see interest that night, then things are right, and I just leave them together and they'll breed, and then usually 3 or 4 nights later they'll lock up again. And I try to get 3 or 4 breeding good solid locks in on a female, and then I feel pretty comfortable with her for the season. But if I put them together and there's no interest in them, they're on separate branches and all, I usually take the male out the next morning, and I'll wait. And it could only be a week later, and you put them together, and right away he's on her again. So I only really keep them together when I actually see them actively pursuing the female. Usually they'll lock up. For me, if the female's ready, they'll lock up within half an hour to an hour, put them together.
Oh, wow. Yeah, with mine, you know, I put mine together in kind of November time. And in early November, I might not see so much activity, but it seems to just get to a point like the last week of November, all of a sudden they just switch on, and the males will constantly breed the females.
Yeah.
Um, and at that point, I just leave them together because what I'll watch for is evidence of that female going through that pre-ovulation. We see it in other boas, so whenever they're developing, whenever the follicles are maturing, that's going to cause a mid-body swelling, not to the same extent as you would get with an ovulation, but you're going to see a mid-body swelling. And you'll see the female sitting in a slightly different angle and so on, and you just pay attention to that. And as long as I'm seeing breedings from that there, then I'll eventually take the male out and I offer the female either a number of small meals or else a large meal.
Right.
And I think we've talked about this in the past or texted about it. That seems to be a trigger for me for Boa imperator, Boa sigma, caninus, hortulana, Ruschenbergeri. As soon as I see that mid-body swell for the pre-ovulation, I hit them with food, and that, like clockwork, those females just trigger. And within a couple of weeks, that female ovulates.
Feed the follicles. Feed the follicles.
That's exactly it.
Yep.
The first time I ever bred Corallus hortulana was a female that I'd had, and she was huge. She like 6.5 feet, eating medium rats, and just an enormous beast. And I put her in with a male while I was cleaning the cage. That's one of those true ones where I had 2 cages, and I put her into his, or his into hers whenever I was cleaning the cage. And within seconds, they locked up. I noticed she was swelling, but I didn't know what it was. This was 26, 27 years ago. I didn't know what was going on. They locked, and then they separated about 2 hours later. And the next day, I gave the female a medium rat. And then 2 weeks later, she blew up like a balloon, and then produced 24 babies for me. 145 days later. It was just, I've always, as soon as I saw that, I was like, yeah, large meals, or once you see pre-ovulation, you got to feed the follicles.
Yeah. An interesting thing is a friend of mine, John Martin. I don't know. Do you know John?
Yeah, I know John. Yeah,
John breeds his emeralds year round, pretty much. Like when he sees his females in a condition that he thinks is right, and he gets litters like randomly throughout the year.
Wow. Yeah, I've thought about that recently. I thought with his are all captive bred animals, right? Because he's working with basins, and he's doing the crosses as well, right? The Batisi caninus crosses.
Yeah.
I've looked at mine. I think the wild caughts are probably in a bit more of a schedule, but I've wondered about the captive bred stuff. Ultimately, people keep complaining that I hold on to the litters that I produce, but I'm just trying to grow up a large group. Ultimately, I'd like to have 10 or 12 males and about 20 or 25 females, so that I could cycle between years and so on, and even try at different times of the year.
Right.
And that would be between anaconda phase and patternless and so on. So it's something I've thought that once I've got a large, more mature group of captive bred animals, can I put them through cycling at different times of the year? Because temperature's not the issue. It's food cycling is the issue. And therefore I can actually drive, hopefully, the maturation of follicles just by putting an animal on a different food cycle. So if I'm doing most of them on they start feeding in February or March, and then they stop in November. For other animals, I could start them in, that food cycling. They feed from June through to, March or whatever. I could put them off cycle and change that and potentially get them breeding, maturing follicles at different times.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I didn't know John was doing that. I haven't seen much from John. He used to post relatively frequently on Facebook, but I haven't seen it for a while. I haven't seen him post for a while.
Yeah, we texted him the other day because he's got some health issues, that he deals with on and off. So we texted him the other day to see how he's doing. He's still doing good. I owe him a visit. I need to go out there and check out his stuff. I owe him a visit. I'll go out and check out and see how everything's doing.
Yeah. So where is he? Is he in Pennsylvania?
No, he's close to the border, though. He's he's probably literally 10, 15 minutes from the border of Pennsylvania, out 78.
Yeah. I'm gonna, once I get back to the East Coast, it's gonna be much easier to go and see these people.
Yeah,
and to check out their animals. I'm really excited about that. Gestation. People have asked me a lot about gestation in emeralds and how long it is, because they read these books and it's like ranges from 120 days to 270 days. No, it doesn't get that long. I find for most of my Corallus, it doesn't matter whether it's caninus or Rischenbergeri or Hortolana, 145 days from ovulation is pretty much what I see as, that's whenever they're going to give birth. They generally go through a post-ovulation shed about 2 to 3 weeks after ovulation. And just like any boas, that tends to be a slightly prolonged shed. So it lasts a couple of weeks while they're in that shed phase. But once they do that, then mine bask. And mine basket, I can hit them with a heat gun and they're going to be sitting at like pretty much 86.4 is what I see my females bask at.
Right.
And I offer that basking site 24 hours a day. At that point, I don't give those females that night drop. I think if you give a night drop, you're going to extend it. So I was talking to someone recently that's with annulatus, and they find theirs are more like 165 days, but they only offer that basking spot during the day for a number of hours. They don't offer it 24 hours. So I think if you offer a 24-hour basking spot, they'll use it. They'll get to that like 145 days for gestation. Have you found something similar, or what do you find?
No, I'm the odd bird. I run ambient on the Emerald Steven, and I keep them like 84, 85 degrees in the room. And this female went 134 days, just keeping ambient at 84, 85 degrees. Of course, my results don't show well this year, but in years past, I've done very well just doing that with the Emerald. So, it could be an anomaly this year, but like we were saying, I'm open to experiment a little bit more too, because, you always want to improve. So.
Yeah. I've always just been of the mindset that animals in the wild can thermoregulate, and putting it really hit home when I started putting emeralds into 4-foot enclosures where they could get from 78 degrees up to 90, 94, 95 degrees. And whenever I was coming in and seeing these emeralds using that entire temperature range, depending on the time of day, whether they'd eaten or not, or whether they were gravid, it made me realize that thermoregulation really is an important thing, at least in my collection. I see it as being something really important. I think they need to be able to get away from hot temperatures when they need it, and to cooler temperatures or to hotter temperatures when they require it. So I find that the mine just bask at like 86.4. That's 86.4 tends to be the mid body temperature that I find for all of my boas, regardless of species. If they're going to produce a healthy litter, it's got a temp around 86.4 with that heat gun. If I see it at like 82 or 83, then it generally suggests something's not going to go well. Yeah. And in the odd times where I've had slugs, the females have been sitting at like 82 degrees. Still coiled and doing the whole beehive, but just sitting at like 82, 83 degrees.
Yeah.
So that seems to be an indicator, at least from my stuff.
Yeah. So just the Sanzinia this year, she was definitely different than the female last year that did so well for me, where, she got dark and she wasn't basking though, like, because the Sanzinia, I do get basking because I keep my Sanzinia background temperature at like 65 degrees year round. Yeah. So, and their basking spot it can be 85 to 87, and this female just wasn't basking at all. But the emeralds, what I wrestle with emeralds, and that's why I wish I knew more about their natural history, is a species that lives in such thick rainforests. The basking, there's going to be breaks in the canopy, I guess, where they can get into sunlight and bask. I just wonder about a species like that in a thick rainforest. And go ahead.
I'm going to tell you that the temperature difference in those little areas where you get the sun coming through is dramatic.
Yeah.
I was just talking to students about it on Tuesday night, with our upcoming Costa Rica trip in November. I said to them, it's amazing that you can walk through the forest and then find an area where a tree fell, and it's like hitting a wall of temperature. It's going from 82 degrees, 81 degrees in the understory where you've got cover, to 90 degrees, 92 degrees, and it's just like a wall. So when you look into the canopy, you see those little breaks as well.
Yeah.
And my feeling is that these animals are probably, because we don't have any real records of gestation behavior in gravid emeralds or gravid Corallus. in general in the wild. But I'm sure they're probably moving to the parts of the tree limb where they can get a little bit more direct heat.
Right.
And it's fine to move away from it because it's not at a temperature that's really cold. But I think that just provides that. I think they can still thermoregulate. I don't think they're just sitting at one spot, one temperature zone for gestation. Just like we find with other animals, boas, they move towards those heat sources.
Yeah, that's like blood pythons were tailor made for ambient conditions. And my experience with those guys, they got me set in my ways with these ambient conditions, I think. But, there's so many little factors, like when a tree is the canopy is collecting sun, does the trunk of the tree itself get heat?
Warm up?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's going to hold on to it very long. I think they're getting it more from just direct absorption from the rays of the sun. And it is amazing, the difference. Like it blows my mind because I got students that want to work on various projects, and one of them was talking about tree falls. And I said, it's going to really suck sitting in those tree fall areas because it's just hot. It's just the sun is beating down on you.
And you got all that humidity.
Then it's humid as shit. Yeah, right. But it does provide quite a significant temperature variation. And it would be interesting. I'm going to have to see if they're available at La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica, where we go. They have these, or had these, 3 towers that were built to get up into the canopies for studies.
Nice.
And I think 1 or 2 of them came down in storms. Remember there was a hurricane came through Costa Rica a couple of years ago. I think it was a hurricane or a tornado, probably a hurricane. And it tore 2 of them down, but I don't know if they've rebuilt those, because I've always wanted to get up into the canopy just to see what it's like.
Yeah.
To experience that, what temperature is it, and those little breaks where the sun's hitting the branch where animals might gather. What are we seeing? Like, I was just looking at pictures of clearly gravid Trinidad tree boas earlier on today in the wild, and they were sitting in crooks of trees, but direct sunlight. You could see breaks in the canopy where the sun was getting into them. So, and the other thing that's interesting is that I don't see my gravid emeralds darken, which I see in other boas.
Yeah, that's strange, right?
Right. So all of my other Corallus will get dark. All of my boas will get dark, but Corallus caninus, I don't notice it.
I don't.
And I'll have to go back and look at some pictures, of the same females during gestation and after it. But if it's anything, it's going to be very minor. It's not that significant.
No.
Kind of real
subtle.
Yeah. So I don't find them a hard species to breed. I think if you go through the standard cycles of food cycles, I think they're really receptive to that there. And as long as they're old enough, you don't want to push them, then you're fine. And like litter sizes, they vary so much. I've heard reports of 1 baby. I've heard, mine seem to average the 5 or 6, and they're not small. These are females that are eating medium rats kind of thing. And I've seen them right up to the 16 or 18 babies. I think Rich Ali was telling me about 16 or 18 babies in a litter, which is just enormous.
Yeah, my largest litter was 14.
Wow.
Yeah, most of my litters seem to average around 9 to 10.
Right, that's a really nice number. That's kind of what I would be shooting for. I'm hoping that my females will be a bit more, as they gain size a little bit. They're not young, but as they gain size, and maturity, they'll produce more offspring. It's not as if they're producing slugs. They're just producing, I'll palpate those females and I'll feel the number of follicles, and that's the number of babies I get.
Yeah.
So they're pretty straightforward. But one of the cool things about breeding them, and I haven't seen it with emeralds, I haven't watched it personally, but I've watched it dozens of times with Amazon tree boas, is that whenever they give birth and they're hanging from the trees, and the tail kind of lifts up a little bit, and the babes are just basically coming out fully formed. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen any coming out in any kind of like birth sac. They just kind of glide right out and they're into the branches, or they drop down to the floor and then they work their way up into the trees. So that whenever I go into my snake room and there's a gravid emerald that's due to give birth, and you can, just like Boa imperator and Boa sigma, you get that look. There's going to be something happening. They're stretching out a little bit more and so on. and then you walk in and there's just a bunch of little babies all sitting under branches, coiled up just like the mother. Such a cool look. Oh man, such a great look. And I just fascinated by them. They're just such a great little species to work with, and it's so much in demand. As soon as I post a picture of baby emeralds, or a gravid female, I can guarantee that my inbox on Instagram or Facebook is going to get crammed with them, with people wanting these things. They're an interesting animal, and it's interesting because you've seen such a variation in price now. Like years ago, I saw captive bred emeralds for like $350,
right?
And now you're looking at $1,500.
Yeah.
Or above. I've had people offer me a lot more money than $1,500 for baby emeralds just to be able to get on a list, and I don't even keep a list for these things.
Right.
Just great animals. So if people can do it, captive bred is the way to go. Breeding. One thing I will say about breeding is that just like other Corallus, they seem to be really into this kind of 2-year cycle. They don't seem to put on enough weight, in my opinion, in a single year. To be able to give birth year after year.
I go 3 years sometimes. Even.
You do? Yeah. So I think minimum 2, and you got to do it by the weight of the female. I don't want to see any spine kind of triangular shape or anything like that there. So it's worth the extra weight. So don't be rushed. If you want a species that you can rush to breed, get corn snakes.
Yeah, exactly.
If you want something that's going to take a little bit longer and be really worthwhile and fulfilling, spend the time. The thing that we should talk about again is wild caught, and it's not just an issue with wild caught because it can be transmitted, and that is the thing that eliminates so many wild caught animals from collections and from the hobby, and probably puts people off keeping emeralds as a result of that, and that's regurgitation. It's been given lots of different names over the years, from chronic regurgitation syndrome to emerald vomiting syndrome to just a lot of different names. But it's characterized by that, you feed the animal a meal, and 3 days later, or at least 2 days later, the female's sitting really uncomfortable and there's bloating, and then, a day later it's a regurgitation on the cage floor in a water bowl. And unfortunately, in 99% of the times that happens, this is a key to or an indicator of some very significant issue. As I said, I think emeralds can handle large meals without regurging. In the wild, they don't get the opportunity to turn around and say, right, I'll wait until that rat goes past. I'm going to take one that's smaller. I'm going to wait for an adult emerald is not going to take an adult mouse over a large rat or whatever.
Right.
So they've evolved to be able to take those meals. They're part of the macrostomata snakes, the big mouth snakes, so they can cope with those things. That regurgitation is really, there's two kind of horrible issues that can drive that. For years, people put it down to temperature and said they were too hot and that the meals were too large. So they recommended keeping emeralds at 78 or 80 degrees. And we've talked about the temperatures that we keep ours at. Mine are ambient of 84. Basking spot, they're using it at 90 degrees. So temperature's not an issue. If it's chronically too high, then that would obviously be a problem. Just as if it's too low, it could also be a problem. But the issues are more likely going to relate to the two pretty nasty issues they can get. One is cryptosporidium, and cryptosporidium has been an issue in importer-exporter facilities for many years. It's even wiped out zoo collections. I believe, was it Dallas-Fort Worth? Their annulated collection was lost due to cryptosporidium, I believe, or one of the zoos. I think it was in Dallas. I think it was Dallas-Fort Worth. This is it's characterized by a mid-body swelling, and that 3 to 4 days after feeding, the animal regurges. And over time, what happens with that is it's not treatable, or it's not very successful being treated, and it causes scarring of the intestinal kind of tract, and the cells that will be releasing hydrogen chloride stop producing it. They become thick, and they can't release those digestive juices, so the animal rots, and then they regurge. It could also be due to inflammation of the intestinal lining, the stomach lining, that causes that regurgitation. The other one that people have been paying attention to over the last number of years is avian chlamydia. So at the exporters' facilities, it's very common that these animals are then housed temporarily in cages that might have had birds prior to that, or they're being fed birds that died, and they're coming into contact with feces from birds that have had avian chlamydia. Now, avian chlamydia is not common in the wild. It's only about, from what I've read, there's only about 1 or 2% of birds have it. But once they get confined in these importer-exporter facilities, then that obviously raises the issue and raises the spread within the import-export group of animals. And you find, just like Cryptosporidium, it causes regurgitation within 3 to 4 days of feeding a meal. And people will argue, well, just feed it smaller meals and lower its temperatures. I can tell you that an adult 5.5 foot emerald is not going to survive on an adult mouse every 2 weeks. They'll just waste away and die. And the problem with it is that it's a systemic issue in that it's a chronic issue. They're going to continually regurge. And with avian chlamydia, it's been shown to impact the cells that release hydrogen chloride again. So therefore, they're not producing digestive juices, and the animals are rotting, and then the animals are dying. There's been a number of studies that have done. Elliot Jacobson has done a lot of work on regurgitation syndrome in emeralds, and he studied a lot of groups. There's a very interesting paper that talks about chlamydiosis, and they followed a group, I think it was about 110 emeralds, of which 81 developed regurgitation syndrome within 0 to, I think it was 23 months. So people think that if it's going to regurge, it's going to regurge immediately. It's not the case. It can take a long time. From the studies that I've read and from talking to people that have imported and dealt with it, it generally shows itself within a year, but it can be longer before it actually becomes evident. And there's some evidence to suggest that if they treat it immediately after that first regurge, they can bring some of them back online, but not a lot. It just seems to be this chronic syndrome that destroys the snake. How it spreads, well, I don't know. That's a really interesting one, because I've seen a room of emeralds, and somebody bring in a wild caught and not quarantine it, and that wild caught regurged, and within 6 months, every single animal in that room, over 20 something animals, began regurging, and they all died. So whether it can be spread, they didn't talk about mites in that collection. Whether it could be spread by mites, I don't know. Whether there's an airborne aspect, I don't know. Maybe Rob knows. But it seems to spread through collections like wildfire, which is why my wild caught stuff is in one building, one facility away from my house, and my captive bred is all here. And whenever I move, if I'm not able to, because my new lab is in a super high-tech biotech kind of building, where I'm not going to be able to have an office full of emerald tree boas, even though it's away from my lab. I just can't have it due to contamination issues. I'm probably going to have them in the same building, but they're going to be in separate rooms on separate air handling systems. Even though they've been with me for over 2 years now, and they're ultra healthy, I'm completely paranoid about introducing those to captive bred animals.
Yeah, agreed.
So, I've spent so long developing this group and working with these wild caughts to bring them online, and they're just spectacular. And the idea of something happening and regurgitation setting in, it just scares the life out of me. So I'd rather just, forget about that. What will happen is that if and when these wild caught ones breed, I'll bring the babies into my group. That's fine. You've got captive bred babies, but the wild caughts I want to separate them from the captive bred lineages that I've got.
Or what's the thought that why emeralds are so susceptible to those two ailments compared to other snakes that come through the same facilities and everything else?
Yeah, I don't know. I know that annulateds are just as bad. So people might not know about annulated tree boas. They can have a bad history of regurgitation syndrome as well. And caninus, well, we obviously don't know about crepani, but caninus and annulatus are relatively close together in evolutionary history. They're closer to each other than they are to hortulanus. and they show that same trend. Why so? I don't know. Why do we not see Hortulanus? I don't even know if they're bound to be able to catch avian chlamydia. They're in the same places. But why do they not show that regurgitation? I don't know. Maybe Hortulanus behaves almost more like a colubrid in terms of how they eat. They seem to eat or readily eat more frequently and digest very fast.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's just that digestion time is an issue. Maybe they're already releasing only a small amount of hydrogen chloride. Maybe they've got a reduced number of hydrogen chloride producing cells that if they get screwed up, then it leads to rotting. Whereas if something that has a faster metabolism like a Hortulanus maybe produces more or has more cells for producing it and therefore knocking a few out, it's not going to make a big deal. I don't know.
Yeah.
Even my annulateds I feed on a reduced schedule compared to my Hortulanus.
Yeah.
And I know they are. They might look like a Hortulanus, but to the kind of those that haven't had experience with it, but they're very different. One, they're placid, which is amazing. They're so secretive, just really, really interesting animals.
Yeah.
Got anything to add, Rob?
No, I think that's perfect, Warren. I was just gonna say that it's it's a bacteria, right, that's spread typically through aerosolized dust. So it's just catching on a little part. We just have shed bacteria in the air that are being taken up. As to why the differentiation between emeralds and Hortulana, I don't know. I think all the points that you laid out might make sense. Even just the gape and the consistency of offering that gape. Maybe that potentially could be it.
Yeah. It's sad because it knocks the wind out of many people that have got these emeralds, and they might be doing well for a couple of months, and all of a sudden they switch. I got some emeralds a number of years ago from what turns out to be a very sketchy. He calls himself an importer, but he's not an importer, from Florida. And those were captive bred. Yeah, you know who it is. Those were said to be captive bred siblings that were a year old, and they arrived and they had big heads and scars. You knew exactly that they were not captive bred, and within 3 months they were regurging. So
it's pitiful to watch. It really is. It's really sad.
Because you're just hoping that maybe you can turn it around. They talk about using some medications, but it just doesn't seem to work. So therefore, when you talk to other people that are really experienced, you talk to Tony Nicolai, or you talk to Ed, or you talk to these people that have worked with lots of emeralds over the years, they're just like, as soon as you see it, euthanize it.
Yeah.
The likelihood of bringing it back is slim, and the likelihood of it spreading is more likely.
Right.
And that's why using those very simplistic Rubbermaid containers for me are so important, because if I put it into a nice, PVC enclosure or a Vision, that sterilizing that thing afterwards, if you had an animal that regurs, is just, it's pointless. Just set it on fire and just get rid of it.
Yeah.
So that's why I go for the Rubbermaid container as that for any animals for that quarantine setup. So it's one other thing we should talk about with breeding is an unusual animal that pops up every now and again, and they're the hybrids, the Amazon tree boa, emerald tree boa hybrids. This is something that caught my eye years ago. I don't know if you remember the reptiles article. I think Stan Shiras, if you remember Stan, he wrote a great article on basin emeralds, and at the end of that article was another article by Dave Barker about hybrids. So they had got a gravid caninus, and it gave birth to a bunch of hybrids.
I saw the babies.
And they talk about that. Yeah. Oh, really? You saw it? Yeah.
Yeah. He brought them to Orlando, actually, and they were amazing.
No way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I saw those, and then every so often a litter would pop up where they would have either all hybrids or else some emeralds and some hybrids. I even bought one whenever I lived in Ireland. I bought one that was produced at an importer's facility in Florida. And while we were waiting for paperwork to come through for that and a bunch of other things, that animal ended up succumbing and it just died. Why, I don't know, but they tend to not have a great history of survival, like many hybrids. So you look at some of the pictures. I'm not aware of any of those original ones being alive, and John produced some. John Martin produced 2 litters, and his were just spectacular. But he produced them in captivity, and they were just spectacular. And talking to John about it, he said that they had trouble shedding. I think they developed respiratory illnesses easy. And I remember years ago talking to another individual about hybrids that they had, and they had to get shunts put in the nostrils because they were developing respiratory issues and breathing issues.
Wow.
So I've got a hybrid here, and you can see pictures of it on my Instagram. It was a litter that was born to a pet store in Las Vegas. They got in some emeralds, and one of them turned out to be gravid. And very shortly after getting it, it dropped a bunch of babies. Some of them were normal emeralds, and some of them were hybrids. I think they thought they were all hybrids, but clearly the emeralds were emeralds. And I think maybe 3 hybrids. I think that was it, something like that. And I got one of them. Dayton Croydon got one of them, and I think the person in the store kept one, or something happened to it. I tried to buy it, but they never responded. That was born. I got it, and it was like an orangey brown color, and it is now grayish blue with cream colored ovals on its back. It's spectacular. Eats great, sheds great, but I'm just kind of waiting for that. What day will it start showing any kind of downturn? Is it fertile or not? Mine's a female. So I'm just, it's a desk pet for me basically at the moment. And I'm just raising it up and seeing what happens. Would I try to make them in captivity? Absolutely. You can guarantee that at some point in time, I'm going to be trying to make those again. Myself and my friend Jonathan Harvey did a number of years ago, but the female died while gravid. She developed this lower respiratory infection that we didn't diagnose. And she had 11 developing follicles in her. They would have been hybrids. I will definitely try to do it in captivity, just for myself, not to sell to anybody, to give to anybody, but just for myself.
Right.
I just think they're fascinating, and I'd like to see how they develop over time. They'll probably all end up chilling out in my freezer, but it's I'd still like to see. The one that I've got at the moment is just great. And the one that Dayton's got looks really good as well. His has got a little bit more pattern. But if anybody wants to see it, just look up my Boa booth Instagram. And I've got pictures of it every month or two, just like baby emeralds going through color changes. And it starts off orangey brown, and now it's gray blue. It's just spectacular.
Very cool.
So they pop up very infrequently, but they pop up here and there.
All right, I think we're kind of running out of time here. One thing I did want to touch on real quickly was the heat sensing pits of the emerald tree boas, which are astonishing, and I think probably more sensitive than any other species that I know of. I've had these. I use the oil-filled radiant heaters, electric heaters in my rooms, and I've taken emeralds out on a perch and literally had those heaters a good 15 feet away from the animal, and the animal will involuntarily strike at that heater, out of nowhere, just from sensing that heat from so far away. I mean, that is an amazing adaptation, evolutionary thing for these animals.
I think it makes sense to be so sensitive.
Yeah.
What we know about those heat sensing pits in boids, and in pit vipers as well, is they are ultra sensitive. I think they can sense temperature changes in the 0.05 degree Fahrenheit kind of range. Really, really minuscule change. But you can imagine why something that's arboreal would have either a heightened sense or more of these heat pits that are more likely to detect change, because they're in a 3-dimensional space where they're trying to find prey.
Right.
It's not like a boa constrictor that's on the ground or whatever, primarily. They're sitting on a branch where they're having to hopefully see movement above them, below them, to the sides of them, not only just prey, but also predators.
Right.
And it's being used for that. If they sense that very minuscule change, then it allows them to get into that feeding mode very rapidly. There's also a lot of work that suggests that things like emeralds and certainly green tree pythons actually come closer to the ground to feed. So you've seen, I think Dan Mallory has posted videos of himself in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, and so on, and they've found emerald or green tree pythons in hunting poses, just feet from the ground, or if that. But I think they really need to sense that minuscule change, so that if they are in the trees and a rodent comes by, that they hit it and they see it, they sense it, and they hit it.
Yeah.
And I would say the same thing. I noticed my animals are extremely sensitive. They appear more sensitive than my Boa Sigma, my Boa Imperator, and they look great. I teach a physiology course, a vertebrate physiology course, and one of the things that I show is whenever we talk about sensory systems, there's a picture of a Corallus caninus, behind me on the screen, just with those enormous heat pits.
Yeah.
They're just remarkable.
Yeah, it's a cool feature of the animal for sure.
Yeah, it really enhances that look, of the face of the animal, just having those really prominent heat sensitive pits. Hortolana has it, Richenberger have them, but not to the same extent.
Yeah.
And what's interesting in the hybrids is that the hybrids will have a head structure very similar to an Amazon, a bit more like it, but they got the heat pit look of the emeralds.
Yeah,
they're really cool.
It is very cool.
Very cool.
I think we've kind of run out of time here, so I guess I'll give the closing here. So thanks for listening to Boas with Warren, Rob, and myself. Please check out the NPR Networks on YouTube channel and the website, moralipythonradio.com. You can follow us on iTunes or Spotify or whatever podcast app you may be using. And we all hope you listen next month, episode of Boas, as we will be talking about some of the West Indian boas, near and dear to Rob's heart. So that'll be a good one.
Yeah, people are actually going to hear Rob. He is here. He just hides in the corner. So in the next episode, he's going to be...
he's going to be the go-to guy.
That's it.
I'm just letting the two experts run with it. No worries, But yeah, I'll have something to say.
All right,
Wonderful.
cool. All right, see you all next time, guys.
All right, guys. It's great talking. Talk to you soon.
Care.